Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you're joining us from, and thank you. In today's Afriforesight webinar on copper and cobalt, African opportunities. My name is Vinesh Chetty. I'm the head of research here at Afriforesight, and I, along with my colleagues, will be presenting on today's topics. For newcomers to this forum, Afriforesight is the largest mining research house in Africa. We have a multidisciplinary team ranging from economists to engineers, and we provide forecasts on Africa's key extracted commodities, as well as research on mining in various African countries. In today's webinar, we'll take a quick look at the global growth forecast before we unpack our forecasts and market analysis for copper and cobalt, with a particular eye on the DRC and Zambia. Although we'll be brief, we will try to cover as much of the content as possible in a short time. All the information which we're presenting today, as well as further details, are included in our various reports, which are available to our subscribing clients. If you are not a client or currently don't have access to any of these aspects, but you would like to find out more, you can contact us at the details on screen now. Sebastian and Marilee would be happy to help you. We will be answering questions at the end of this presentation. If you would like to submit a question, please do so through the Q&A function. You'll find the Q&A button near the top center of your screen on Teams. If you click there, you should be able to type your question, and we'll answer as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. If you need to leave early, you could also email Sebastian or Marilee with a question. A recording of today's session will be made available later, and you should be able to access it on the same link which you used to join this webinar. Before we get into the commodities themselves, I'd like to take a quick look at the world economy. And what you see on screen is data on the growth rate, the change in the world economy, and then in the blue, Afriforesight's forecast for the world economy. So these bars represent the change in the world economy size. Over here in 2020, you see that's the COVID recession where the world economy shrank. And then over here, you see is the sharp bounce back in 2021. Now, the forecast you see in blue was created in-house by Afriforesight, and this was done by our research team led by our chief economist, Nathan Musson. The main things to note here are that 2024's growth is positive. Afriforesight does not see a global recession. Now, while 2024 is not a recession, it is slower growth than our years going forward. Now, to start with, why is growth relatively slow in 2024? This has mainly been due to the wave of inflation. As the world came out of the pandemic lockdowns, there was a wave of inflation. And to combat that, central banks around the world raised interest rates. And in simple terms, when interest rates are high, that tends to put downward pressure on the world economy. From a consumer perspective, if people have to spend a lot of money on their home loans and their car loans, they have less money to spend on other things. And from a business perspective, when the cost of getting loans is high, it makes it harder for businesses to take out loans to buy new equipment to expand their factories. So when interest rates are high, as they have been recently, that puts downward pressure on the world economy. But as I said, the world economy is not we are not forecasting a recession in 2024. This is not COVID. This is not world financial crisis time. And this is important because many commodities tend to move with the world economy. When the world economy is on the up, it is often like the rising tide that lifts all ships. The world economy does well and commodity prices tend to rise. Now, 2024 is weak, but it is growing. And the two main growth pillars here are the United States and China. Despite the high interest rates, consumers in the US are still spending on things like cars and concerts and travel. So that keeps the world economy growing. While China is experiencing slower growth than before, it is still growing, and it's still at a high percentage, whether it be 4 or 5%. That's still a lot of growth in the world's second largest economy. While China's slowdown does hurt commodity prices, overall the world economy is growing. Europe is the weakest region, and it has its own regional problems, particularly high energy costs as it has attempted to shift away from Russia. Now, that points to deglobalization. This is a big part of why you see that these growth rates are a little bit slower than they used to be before, is that the world is slightly delinking. We're seeing Western Europe trying to get away from Russian energy. We're seeing the United States trying to put up tariffs against Chinese goods, and their European counterparts also tariffing Chinese goods. And in simple terms, these trade barriers slow the world economy down. They create friction in the world economy, they create inefficiencies and slow things down. That's why we don't see growth getting back to their pre-COVID highs. Now, we do see growth picking up, and a lot of this is on interest rates declining. We've already seen the European Central Bank cut interest rates, and we expect their US counterparts to do the same soon. And as those interest rates come down, that puts more money in the pockets of consumers, more money for businesses to expand. That helps the world economy pick up. But this delinking of countries around the world, the increasing trade tariffs, those things slow the world economy down just a little bit. That's because it removes choice, and those trade barriers can create inefficiencies. That said, while the trade barriers can create inefficiencies, they can also create opportunities for countries that don't get hit with those tariffs. So while US consumers will now pay more for goods coming in from China, it creates opportunities for countries such as India, Vietnam, and Mexico to increase exports to the US and Europe. And that's partly why we see so much growth in those regions. So going forward, we see a lot of growth as interest rates come down. And while the global delinking slows things down, it does create opportunities for new countries to ramp up their production. Another big part of why growth is picking up going forward is investment in green technologies. We're seeing many companies and countries try to decarbonize, try to switch away from petrol and diesel powered cars to electric vehicles, curbing natural gas usage, ramping up things like electric heat pumps. And copper and cobalt get a boost from that. Cobalt for its use in batteries, and copper in general for electrification. Now, there's a lot of money going into this green transition, and it's not just new technologies. Even simple things like grids need electricity, and Western countries need to ramp up their grids. And even in developing countries, as people move to cities, we need to build out more electrical grids in developing parts of Africa and Asia. And while both copper and cobalt get a boost from this, copper in particular is very tied to the world economy. Those of you who follow the market for a long time will know that when the world economy rises, copper tends to do very well. And that's often because copper is so tied into so many sectors in the world economy. So in simple terms, we expect the world economy to pick up going forward, and copper and cobalt to receive a boost. For more on that, I'll hand you over to Kirsty.
So starting off with copper demand, we see demand rising from electrification as well as battery technology and renewable energy and water infrastructure. So we see the urbanization of emerging economies should contribute to the rising demand, as the expansion of power grids are expected in developing countries, and the repair and modernization of infrastructure is expected in advanced economies. We also expect demand growth from renewable power generation and from battery technology as the world moves towards green energy sources. As some countries aim to reach net zero carbon emissions, we expect rising demand for copper from the construction of solar, wind, and hydrogen plants. The electric vehicle transition should also be a large demand driver. Fully electric cars use up to 5 times more copper than conventional cars for the battery, the electric motor, and cable connecting purposes. The expansion of the EV charging network should also require significant copper cabling. However, demand growth should be capped somewhat by the high incidence of copper theft in some countries, and that is expected to shift copper use towards using more aluminium, especially in vulnerable applications such as publicly accessible wiring. So this figure shows the rising copper deficit if current mining, recycling, and consumption rates are maintained. The supply gap will continue to widen, especially in the late 2020s onwards. Supply from recycling is expected to grow only slowly because copper remains in use for a long time. It's also able to be recycled several times without losing its inherent properties. Therefore, recycled supply would not be enough to meet the growing demand. The increasing copper deficit should encourage some miners to start new copper mines or expand existing operations. The copper deficit is also expected to put upwards pressure on prices, which should further incentivize miners to increase production. This could result in some governments attempting to shorten permitting cycles and reduce project lead time, and should also encourage friendlier policies to attract more investment into copper mining. We expect the overall future demand for copper to be positive, and we expect rising supply growth to try and meet demand. So about 35% of supply comes from South America, where production has been rising, but these increases are capped by supply constraints, such as frequent community protests, stricter government regulations, water scarcity, and declining ore grades. As we see new mines planning to start production, there are also existing mines which are nearing the end of their life. So the slow supply growth from South America creates the potential for African supply to gain more market share. We expect production increases from the DRC and Zambia due to the Central African Copper Belt. In the DRC, production should rise as existing projects expand and new projects start up alongside increasing investment in copper mining. However, copper mining in the DRC faces some constraints, such as inadequate transport infrastructure and logistical challenges, which can cap mining activities and expansion efforts. The lack of a major port makes exporting materials difficult, with most exports going through surrounding countries, such as Tanzania, South Africa, and Angola. Sometimes trucks also face border crossing backlogs, which slows down the transport of ore for export. The DRC is also renegotiating some mining contracts with Chinese companies. The government engaged in negotiations with some companies such as CMOC and Sicko Mines to ensure that the DRC receives a fair share of revenues and to address concerns regarding regulatory and environmental issues in effort to improve contract transparency. Despite some constraints to supply, such as the logistics infrastructure and some unethical mining practices, there are increasing efforts to support the mining industry, such as the government promoting the mining sector through policies to attract foreign investments, the ongoing efforts such as infrastructure development initiatives to improve regulatory framework, as well as reducing corruption and unethical practices, should aid in attracting more foreign investment. The DRC's production had increased 14% in 2023 from 2022, and further production increases are expected. Zambia also aims to increase copper production, targeting 3 million tons production by 2030, up from the current capacity of 800 kilotons per annum. Government plans to introduce many reforms to support its production target, including formalizing artisanal and small-scale mining, developing a stable taxation regime, and placing emphasis on sustainable mining practices, alongside some improvements to the transport sector, such as road and railway development. The government also plans to enhance electricity supply for mines, and this has been a constraint in the Zambian mining industry in recent times. There has been hydropower supply disruptions, which capped or suspended some copper mining activity in 2024. So Zambia plans to diversify their energy sources by investing in solar power and renewable energy initiatives. So in summary, we expect the DRC and Zambia to ramp up copper production as miners ramp up or start new projects, and we should see some government incentives and regulations supporting the supply growth from the DRC and Zambia. Some of the key projects in these countries are, in the DRC, we have CMOC's Tenke Fungurume mine, which restarted exports in 2023 after settling a dispute with the state-owned miner Geka Mines. And they now aim to go ahead with their expansion plans in 2024, as well as the KFM mine, which plans to boost production. We have the Kamoa-Kakula mine in the DRC, which is on track to ramp up their production from early 2025. In Zambia, the Mopani mine has gained investment from Abu Dhabi's International Resources, and they should use some of this funding to go ahead with their expansion plans as well. The Lumwana mine also plans to increase production by 60% by 2028. So just looking at this cost curve, this is a cost curve by company, and this shows the production on the x-axis with the width of the bar representing the scale of production for each mining company shown below. And the y-axis is the total cash cost per company with the average copper price for the fourth quarter 2023 shown as the red line. We see that the majority of producers costs were well below the average price of copper, and they remain profitable. Therefore, they could increase production. We see that the companies that mine in Africa remain profitable, such as Glencore, Marubeni, and Barrick Gold. We should also note that the price of copper is now higher than the fourth quarter of 2023. So we should see some increasing profitability for these higher cost miners in Africa, like MMG, First Quantum Minerals, and Zambia's ZCCM. As the copper price continues rising, we should see some increasing production overall to meet the growing demand. And with that, we have the forecast for copper prices, which should increase on the slow supply growth from South America and Africa, alongside improving demand for electricity, water infrastructure, renewable energy development, and as electric vehicles gradually gain market share. Towards the end of the period, price increases should be supported by the rising need for global electrification in developing countries, as well as more developed countries expanding their electrical grids due to the rising demand from EV charging networks, as well as the need for increasingly larger data centers as new technologies improve, such as AI, which requires more copper wiring. So that concludes the copper section. Now handing you over to Hannah for cobalt.
Hello, thank you. So I will be discussing the demand, supply, and also the 18-month price forecast for copper. So firstly, if we look at demand, we can see from the graph that the largest demand driver comes from the battery sector, where cobalt is used as a key component in the cathode of some lithium-ion batteries used in EVs and also portable electronics like laptops and cell phones. EVs specifically are expected to be a significant contribution to the demand for the remainder of the year and also in 2025. This should continue. This should, however, be capped with efforts to replace cobalt in batteries with more ethically sourced and environmentally friendly materials. In the near term, the global automotive and electronics demand should remain weak as high interest rates in many regions discourage consumer demand. These elevated interest rates, as well as the softening of EV sales targets in key regions like the US and the EU, should also hold back EV uptake in these regions. However, demand is expected to rise towards the end of the forecast period as more governments and automakers encourage EV sales to meet their carbon emission targets. Demand growth should be held back somewhat as alternative cobalt-free battery chemistries, such as lithium iron phosphate, also known as LFP batteries, and some sodium-ion batteries slowly weigh on demand in the automotive and also the renewable energy sectors. Okay, so although we do expect demand for EV batteries to increase over the forecast period, the transition should be slower than the market had originally anticipated. Factors contributing to the slower uptake are the softening of the EV sale targets in the US and also in the EU. This should delay the shift away from the internal combustion engines. Another factor is the tariffs placed on Chinese products by the US and the EU. So China, they are currently the largest EV manufacturers and exporters. So with these tariffs in place, it will increase the prices which is expected to discourage sales. So if we look at the global vehicle sales graph, it shows the market share of internal combustion engines in orange, the plug-in hybrid EVs in blue, and the battery-powered EVs in green. So we do expect the internal combustion engine sales to decline over the next few years. And this graph also shows the consumer preference for plug-in hybrid vehicles. So these are expected to gain market share at a faster rate compared to the fully battery-powered EVs. Hybrids, they use less battery metals like cobalt and lithium compared to the BEVs. So as this gains market share, demand is expected to be limited. Also, with the increasing use of battery-free lithium iron phosphate batteries, which are cheaper and now also with comparable driving ranges with that of the NMC cathode batteries, we expect them to become more popular over time. Okay, so the graph shows the mine supply in blue and the demand curve in red. Recycled batteries, they are expected to contribute to supply in the long term, but it is currently not a large market, which is why it's not shown on this graph. So the supply and demand forecast shows that with the current mining rates, a supply deficit may be present in the late 2020s. This is much smaller than the supply deficit expected in copper. So even though we do expect demand to increase, this should be limited due to the shift away from the cobalt-containing batteries, as was previously mentioned. And the graph also shows that the current supply surplus is expected to continue for the remaining of this year, and this should ease in 2025 as demand rises. So cobalt is mainly mined in the DRC, and it accounted for 74% of the global supply in 2023. Despite the weak prices, we do see supply increasing from the DRC, where cobalt is mined as a byproduct of copper. So with the high copper prices and the promising future demand, this should support cobalt supply. In Indonesia, where cobalt is mined as a byproduct of nickel, it is currently the second largest supplier. We expect supply from Indonesia to increase, but this should be constrained in the near term as some nickel producers have reduced or suspended output amid the low nickel prices. So in Indonesia, delays in the mining quota approvals, they have also impacted the production schedules, which is also expected to hold back supply from that region. So the limited supply does create opportunity for the DRC to increase their production. The DRC does have its own factors limiting supply. Because copper and cobalt are mined together, the transport, power, logistical, and also the governmental issues are very similar to that of copper. So these include the lack of the major ports and also the hydropower supply disruptions, especially in Zambia. So in addition, cobalt mining is associated with a number of social issues, and that includes the use of child labor, the poor working conditions. There have also been reports of toxic waste from these mines contaminating the water and the food supplies in the vicinity. This has resulted in a reduction in the availability of the fresh water, health concerns, and also a decline in food supplies for the local population. These factors are all contributing to the shift away from the use of cobalt in batteries. However, companies such as Glencore and China's CMOC, they have stated that they are committed to complying with the environmental laws and monitoring the water quality. There's also the Fair Cobalt Alliance, and members of those include Tesla, Glencore, Volvo, and also CMOC. They are committed to creating transparency in the mining sector, which should improve the mining practices and ease the shift away from the DRC's cobalt. Some battery manufacturers, they are also using battery passports that provide the origins of the battery metals and ethical sourcing of them, which should also improve demand. So with these policies in place and the hope of improving the ethical constraints, we do see supply rising in the DRC. So if we look at a few of the key mining projects, these include ERG. They plan to restart the Comide copper cobalt mine, where they are targeting 14 kiloton per annum of cobalt production by the end of 2025. And after the planned phase 3 capacity expansion, production should increase to 15 kilotons per annum. So in Zambia, Afriforesight plans to fund the development of cobalt sulfate refinery, where they're aiming to start production at the end of 2025. And this should have an initial capacity of 6 kilotons per annum with the potential to double that. So finally, if we look at the cobalt price forecast, prices should continue to trend downwards over 2024, and this is because of the weaker than expected electric vehicle demand growth and also the rising supply from the DRC and also Indonesia. Thereafter, prices should rise on gradually improving EV demand as governments and automakers incentivize EV sales to meet their emission targets. However, demand growth should be capped somewhat by efforts to replace cobalt use in batteries with more ethically sourced materials. Okay, thank you. So that brings us to the end of cobalt. I will now be handing over to Vinesh, who will lead the questions and answers part of the presentation.
Right. Thank you very much. I see we do already have some questions in here. I think, Kirti, we'll start off with the copper one. So the first question here is China a big supplier of copper?
Yeah, so China is a supplier of refined copper. They're a very small producer of mined copper. However, they are the largest globally in refining of copper. So in the refined copper market, China does have a global impact.
Very much. And again, please, if anyone else has a question, please do click the Q&A button and type it. We'll try and answer as many of these as we can. Kirti, then maybe on the other side of the copper production scale there's a question around South Africa and how significant we are to copper supply globally.
Okay, so South Africa mines less than 1% of global copper supply. We have copper production from PGM byproducts. We also have the Phalaborwa copper mine, which it's an underground mine and they produce copper. We have the Okia copper project and the Prieska copper project under development as well.
True. So yeah, interesting ones. China's a big consumer. South Africa is a relatively small player. Then Hannah, over on the cobalt side of things, there's a question around which country is the big importer of cobalt ores and concentrates?
So the largest importer is China, and this is because the manufacturing of the EV batteries, they are the largest suppliers. So yes, China.
Very much. I think that'll be true of a lot of raw materials. Maybe just while on it, there is an interesting battery aspect that you touch on there. So yeah, China's a big importer, and a lot of that is to feed their battery manufacturing. So this is also a critical part of the global supply chain. That whoever's making these electric vehicles, they're very often tied into a China battery maker. There's not a lot of battery making outside of China or Asia specifically.
Yes.
Then, sure. So on hybrid vehicles, and maybe we'll go to Kirti for this one. There's a question around hybrid vehicles and their copper use. Does a hybrid vehicle use more copper than a petrol-powered car? How does that work?
Yes. So a hybrid powered vehicle compared to a normal combustion engine vehicle will take more copper. However, a hybrid vehicle will probably use less copper than a fully electric vehicle.
Okay.
And this is because it requires more copper cabling for the batteries, also copper cabling for the motor. There's small components in the battery itself that uses copper. So there'll be a higher demand from our hybrids and EVs compared to the combustion engines.
Okay. Then I see we've got a question here around the Chinese housing market, Kirti. So I think maybe let me start out with or let me ask you on the copper side of things, does much copper go into housing? And then I'll deal with the rest of the question. So is housing a big consumer of copper?
Yeah, so the construction sector and residential construction does use copper, mainly for electrification. It goes into your wiring into the house. It also depends on consumer demand, as most appliances would also need copper. So yes, if we have a bigger demand for building houses and furnishing these houses, we should see copper demand rise.
True. And then the other part of the question is really around, how do we see things going with the Chinese housing market? So it's a very interesting question, because traditionally we've seen China just build more. That has been China's go-to when its economy slumps, build roads and railways and ports and houses. But that's not what we've been seeing lately. This housing one has been happening for a long time. And the Chinese government seems to be taking a softer touch approach to things. So instead of simply setting a target and saying, we want you to build 1 million houses, the government is instead lowering the interest rates a little bit, or lowering reserve ratios, or helping people buy their first home. So it's a bit of a softer touch. It's one we haven't usually seen, but we do expect that, quite simply at this point, the housing sector is very large in China's economy. So we do expect the government to keep supporting it. Some form of stimulus should keep coming to help prop up the housing market in China. It might not be the old style, just build for the sake of building, but we do think stimulus will come to help correct the Chinese housing market. All right, then there's an interesting one here on synthetic materials. I think maybe, Kirti, it's a little broad, but the question is basically, how do we see synthetic materials affecting commodity demand?
So we have synthetic variations for a lot of materials that we see going into construction and production of a lot of things. A good example of that would be graphite. So we have mined graphite supply, and there's synthetic graphite. We also see this with rubber. We have our natural rubber from plantations in Southeast Asia, and we have synthetic rubber being produced from petrochemical processing. But what we've been noticing is when natural supply is low, producers tend to use synthetic versions. However, creating synthetic versions of these materials are usually more energy intensive and usually more environmentally damaging. So we do see a preference for natural materials being used, even if it means that these materials are mined. It's generally less energy intensive, and it's less environmentally polluting to use our natural materials.
Then an interesting one here around DRC. So there is still an active war going on in Eastern DRC. South Africa has troops there, and we've actually unfortunately lost some soldiers recently. But the question is broadly around, how does that affect copper and cobalt production? So I do know the copper belt tends to be more in the southern DRC, but Kirti, does that affect road transport or things along those lines?
Yeah, so it can affect road and rail, mainly because then you would need some sort of protection or pay for security services. There's also certain regions that you would just have to avoid. So that causes a lot of rerouting of transport routes. Even at mines, there are certain situations where I think it's more towards the cobalt mining. You would need to either suspend mining activity and get staff to safety, or you would need to spend on higher security just to ensure that your staff is secure in the mine.
Oh, very much. Unfortunately, we've seen this. A lot of insurance companies only want to insure southern districts in DRC, and we've seen what can happen in Mozambique as well with the LNG project. So unfortunately, these things can happen. There are risks involved in Africa, but as we saw with copper, there aren't really easy places in the world to extract copper. You've got difficulties in the DRC and Zambia, but you've also got difficulties in South America. So that's part of what keeps those prices up. Then maybe one on a more optimistic note here. There's a question around opportunities for South African companies based on this copper cobalt. Maybe Kirti, I know we do have some copper prospects in South Africa.
Yes, we have the Prieska copper mine, which is still in development. I think they're currently doing their definitive feasibility study, and should that prove successful, we should see some production starting up in the coming years. There's the Ukip mine that's also under development. The Palabora mine has been in steady production for a while. Yeah, and then we also have our small byproduct production from our PGM miners, which is profitable for them, especially since the copper price is rising. But yeah, I'm sure in surrounding African countries like Zambia, Botswana also has a small copper mine production. South African companies could also invest in our neighboring countries.
True, and we probably could pick up some of the logistics as well, because Zambia doesn't have ports, and DRC is also almost entirely landlocked, so we could pick up a little bit there as well. Maybe just Hannah on cobalt. I do believe South Africa has some cobalt, but it's very small production, correct?
Yes. So South Africa is not a large cobalt producer.
Okay. Then maybe sticking with cobalt and batteries in general, there's a question here around sodium batteries. So I do know these are relatively new technologies, but if you could give us a bit of a simple outlook of how is a sodium battery different to a cobalt battery, and what are the advantages?
Yes. Okay. So sodium ion batteries, they use sodium instead of lithium as the electrolyte. So sodium is very abundant, and it is more accessible compared to the metals like cobalt and lithium. So this decreases the cost of the batteries, which is supporting the increasing use of them. There are currently 2 EVs that are powered by sodium ion batteries, although the driving ranges are less than half compared to the lithium ion batteries. Yeah, and we're also seeing that there is an increased use of the sodium-ion batteries in the renewable energy sector for energy storage units there. So yeah, so this is expected to increase with time, especially because they are a lot cheaper than the LIBs.
Very interesting. Maybe sticking with EVs themselves. So we've seen a bit of a decline in EV sales recently. There was a time when growth looked very rapid, but that seems to be slowing down. Do we maybe know what's causing that? I know we have tariffs coming, but it looks like even ahead of the tariffs, we're seeing a bit of a slowdown.
Yeah, so EV sales, they did start declining even before the tariffs, and this is because everyone was optimistic about EVs, but as soon as consumers they started purchasing them, they realized that they were not as convenient as the internal combustion engines because of the limited charging stations. Also, they are more expensive. Yeah, so this has caused a slowdown in the sales. Yeah, but this is expected to improve, especially with as we try to meet our carbon emission targets.
True, and I think sometimes as well we do have to remember that those EVs often cost a lot more than petrol-powered cars.
Yeah,
and in developing countries, we do have issues with those high costs. Maybe then there is a question here around rail and logistics in Zambia. So particularly the Lobito rail project. So we have been seeing some movement there. Ivanhoe in particular really wants that project moving. So we've seen, and this is a DRC into Angola project. DRC Zambia Angola project. So we have been seeing some movement here. I think just last month, and this is a story we ran in our Monday morning, is that we've seen container wagons being built for the railway line. So this again should give more opportunities for Zambia DRC copper miners, cobalt miners to move their raw materials out, or to move their commodities out. So while right now a lot of stuff needs to be railed or trucked towards South Africa, this would give them opportunities out into Angola. Right. So I think those are some of the questions. Please, again, if anyone else has a question, do click on the Q&A button. And then I'm just checking if we have anything else coming through here. So yeah, as far as copper cobalt goes, maybe just to round out on the African producers, Kirsty, who are our biggest African copper producers, and then Hannah, our cobalt producers?
So our biggest copper producers in Africa are the DRC and Zambia currently. South Africa is a very small producer. So that's the top three.
Excellent. And Hannah on cobalt?
So in cobalt, it is the DRC, and then also in Africa would be Zambia. But yeah, the second largest supplier is Indonesia. Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So at this point, I'm not seeing any extra questions coming through. Oh, sorry. So we've actually, sorry, maybe just one more to round out here. Kirsty, maybe anything on copper mining in Angola? Interesting question coming through.
Yeah, so copper mining is not very established in Angola. But recent news, I think the end of last year, Ivanhoe announced that they're starting copper exploration in Angola. So if their exploration efforts are successful, we should see more developments from Ivanhoe on whether there would be some copper production out of Angola.
Very interesting, and from what we've seen with prices being high and profitability being good, it does make sense that companies would keep exploring for copper. As I said earlier, if you do have any extra questions or comments, or if we weren't able to get to yours, we will reach out via email. If you would like to understand more about what we do, if you'd like to get access to more of our reports, please do reach out